In my dreams, I saw the advance towards socialism. As Georges Sorel puts it, it is a process of moving from a regime of forced cooperation to a regime of free cooperation. This regime of free cooperation requires the advance of the syndicates in manufacturing, the ramping up of vocational education, and a rejection of the dogmas of progress that Kautsky believed in, where trusts mark the vehicle towards socialism under the democratic state. Instead, Sorel posits that the holding system must take the character of an association of syndicates, similar to the German cartels of the time, rather than the American trusts. It is only through this method that true proletarian socialism can be achieved, as opposed to the bourgeois state socialism that was emerging out of the state monopoly cartel system at the time. Under this regime of association between syndicates, the foremen and the engineers will advise the workers as chemistry professors advise their pupils, heightening the technical skill of the proletarian. Vocational education will take the forefront, and socialism will be a catastrophe for the intellectuals.
The first thing I'd like to do is apologize for the lack of content. I was busy finishing off my bachelor's degree, but now I am completely done school and won't be returning to do my master's degree until a year from now. This means that I'll have plenty of free time outside of my job to make content. And there's also something very special planned, which you would know of if you follow my Twitter account. Therefore, consider this to be a new era for the channel, in which the focus will be on textual analysis. A real theory cell channel here on SchizoTube. This video will be an analysis of the chapter titled The Advance Towards Socialism in Georges Sorel's book, The Illusions of Progress. The chapter is at the very end of the book, which I have acquired through UC Press Voices Revived. To begin, I think it is appropriate to begin with a quote from the preceding chapter, Greatness and Decline, which frames Sorel's philosophy in his previous book, Reflections on Violence.
In May 1899, I published in Rivista Italiana di Sociologia an article on Marxism and social science. I ended it by expressing the wish that socialism be transformed into a moral philosophy. This change would have infused with greatness a movement that at that time lacked it almost to the same degree as democracy itself. Only several years later was I able to outline a solution to the problem I had posed. The Reflections on Violence is a moral philosophy based on the observations of what took place in revolutionary syndicalism. It is hardly necessary to say that this book has remained unintelligible to Democrats and, in general, to all people who do not understand the laws of greatness and decline.
Here Sorel alludes to the fact that the Reflections on Violence poses a moral philosophy for socialism that is premised on a notion of greatness and decline. Here the general strike is seen as a heroic endeavor, which seeks to save civilization from the decadence with which the bourgeoisie and the intellectuals are working towards. Their dream is a democratic social peace where mediocrity prevails in the institutions, one that slowly morphs into a bourgeois state socialism, a socialism mainly of distribution, in which finance takes the helm. The revolution, as represented by the general strike, becomes a voluntary participation on behalf of the proletariat to awaken the spirit of decadent bourgeois society by taking hold of the means of production by their syndicates and developing a proletarian form of socialism. This is in the interests of civilization, and is part of a cyclical process in history's development of the productive forces, where civilizations go through periods of greatness and decline often caused by decadence. In the stage of decadent bourgeois democratic mediocrity, Sorel posits what men who are aware of the present situation must do until that time of awakening.
The present time is not favorable to the idea of grandeur, but other times will come. History teaches us that greatness cannot be absent indefinitely in that part of mankind which possesses the incomparable treasures of classical culture and the Christian tradition. While waiting for the days of awakening, men who are aware ought to work towards becoming enlightened, disciplining their minds, and cultivating the most noble qualities of their souls without worrying about what democratic mediocrity will think of them.
In the footnotes of these passages, Sorel is reminded of a letter by Gustave Flaubert, where he jokes about creating a dictionary on accepted ideas.
While completing the correction of the proofs on this book, I am reminded of a letter in which Flaubert expressed the hatred he felt for the prevailing mediocrity. In 1852, he wrote that he would wanted to compose a dictionary of accepted ideas. The preface in particular excites me strongly. It would be the historical glorification of everything that is approved. In it, I would demonstrate that majorities have always been right, while minorities have always been wrong. I would sacrifice all the great men to all the imbeciles. Thus, for literature, I would establish that mediocrity, being within everyone's reach, is alone legitimate, and that it is necessary thus to banish every form of originality as dangerous, stupid, etc. From this line of argument, I would arrive at the modern democratic idea of equality.
I found this quote by Flaubert very apt at describing the present state of education, academia, and media. Ultimately, the mediocrity and the intelligentsia rules the day, once the practice becomes for everyone. Now it is time to delve into the chapter The Advance Towards Socialism. The first part deals with the three different types of capitalism, the simultaneity and succession of these types of capitalism, as well as exposing the Hegelian bias within Marx's thought.
The ideas expressed by Marx on the advance towards socialism are closely connected with the considerations I have presented on historical evolution. Until the past few years, they were thought to be of interest only to the commentators of capital. Today, they play an important role in discussions that have been begun on the historical legitimacy of Bolshevism. Lenin is violently accused by the mediocre experts of social democracy of acting in contempt of the laws Marx supposedly established. There is thus a serious, practical interest in examining the economic stages and the advance towards socialism.
The economic stages of capitalism approaching socialism are a relevant conversation to the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, as the Social Democrats accused Lenin of acting in contempt of Marx's laws. Sorel intends to explore these laws that Marx established and bring the truth to light.
According to Marx, there are three types of capitalism. Usury and commercial capital are secondary forms present in history before capital in its fundamental form, which determines the economic organization of modern society. Elsewhere, he calls them the two brothers. And here is another essential text. In pre-capitalist society, the usurer can take possession of everything that surpasses what is absolutely necessary to the existence of the one to whom he loans. The usurer capitalist can then take possession of the total surplus value. The result is that usury capital paralyzes the productive forces instead of developing them, and perpetuates the miserable situation in which, contrary to what happened under capitalist production, the social productivity of work is incapable of developing by means of work at the expense of work itself. Earlier philosophers were not in a position to reproach usury capitalism the way Marx does. They thought that interest constituted an economic paradox that could not be legitimized according to the principles of societies of workers, artisans, or small merchants. For the production of usury profit does not appeal to the responsibility of man. The usurer very much resembles the keeper of a gambling house. The latter speculates on the folly of customers who, after having lost, persist in trying their luck in the hopes that the future will bring them the means of restoring their loss. The usurer speculates on the naivety of poor people who imagine that, by causing themselves much privation, they will succeed in reimbursing, even with large additional charges, the loan the capitalist makes them in order to permit them to await the sale of their products. One of the most opprobrious practices of the usurer is the forcing of payment of debts in times when economic difficulties overwhelm the debtor. The usurer can then either make him accept more inequitable contracts or even seize his wages.
Here we see Sorel using Marx to explain that the usurer acts as a sort of despotic bandit who takes tribute of the fruits of production without contributing anything to production. The usurer is rooted in a pre-capitalist despotism that is almost criminal-like. Sorel likens the usurer to a keeper of a gambling house who speculates on the follies of poor individuals whom are ensnared with debt and keep playing to recouple their losses. It is this form of speculative usurious capitalism that must be the first to disappear in a lawful and orderly socialist society. Sorel continues explaining these facets of the usurer.
When the usurer limits himself to helping a prosperous business instead of tyrannizing peasants and artisans, he quickly acquires the respectability that the metropolises, especially the seaboard ones, concede to the great merchant himself. Moralists go to great lengths to justify his operations. Finally, there comes a time when politicians, enlightened by the economist, regard as an accomplishment of the greatest social utility the establishment of banks that, as a matter of course, put capital in the service of business. In countries where economic activity is weakening, we see a remarkable resurgence of usury capitalism. It finances the operations of foreigners who are less lethargic than the natives of the country. France has often been reproached for being more concerned with lending its money than investing it in native industries. It is good to study modern history from this point of view. The depredations and violence of the Venetians, says Marx, form one of the bases of the abundance of capital in the Netherlands, to whom Venice in its decline lent substantial amounts. Its turn Holland, fallen from industrial and commercial supremacy near the end of the 17th century, saw itself compelled to make its great capital productive by lending it abroad, and from 1701 to 1776, particularly in England, its victorious rival. And the same situation now exists with regard to England and the United States. The present-day swindlers of the stock exchange are not unlike the old usurers. They exploit in the well-to-do bourgeois the same illusions that put the poor people at the mercy of the rapacious money holders. The great material difficulties between these operations should not prevent us from recognizing their psychological similarities. The stock market is a true gambling house, where the most fantastic hopes are stimulated in actuality for the sole profit of the speculator. Who does not share the hopes? The promoters have the habit of introducing shares at a price appreciably higher than their face value, and the good bourgeois, who has spent his life in saving, lets himself be trapped by misleading promises. In the faith of misleading brochures, he imagines that the future will bring enormous profits. As the financial markets undergo sudden changes, the great speculators have many opportunities to put in their own coffers the shares that they covet and that enable them to control the best business.
Sorel explains that in countries where economic activity begins to weaken, capital is exported from the home country to countries where labor is more easily exploited. This happened with regard to Venice to the Netherlands to England, from England to the United States, and now from the United States to China, and perhaps with the Trump administration now to India. The swindlers of the stock exchange are not unlike the old usurers, and the stock exchange is a true gambling house where the well-to-do bourgeoisie is exploited by the promoters and speculators by misleading brochures which appeal to their illusions. Through this, the speculators are able to put into their coffers the shares that enable them to control the best business. This is why Hudsonites say that Western economies are essentially just people scamming each other with hardly anything of value being produced. It is a speculative debt bubble economy that is doomed to collapse once dollar hegemony becomes a thing of the past.
Formerly, there were many unsuccessful laws against usurers. The modern laws that aim to regulate the operations of the stock market do not seem to have very good results up to now. It does not seem likely that the swindlers can be prevented from deceiving their victims by means of very cleverly worded prospectuses. The only effective thing the state has succeeded in doing up until now has been to intervene in times of crisis, to aid the large banks in cooperating to limit the effects of disaster. We can say that, as usury plays on the fantasies of its victims, fantasies which are basically identical in the most enlightened bourgeois and in the most backward people. In the same way, commerce plays on probable increases in price. The price might appreciate because of different locales, between which transport of merchandise would be established. Seasonal differences, which the storming of goods makes ideally contemporary in the books of commerce, or different ways of presenting articles to the public, in wholesale or retail form, for example. Usury and commerce have many points in common. I will point out a few that are very obvious. In general, they do not create very lasting establishments. It is rather rare that the son of a usurer or merchant possesses the quality of sang-froid, of proper appreciation of the probabilities, or of constant attention to business, which has assured the successes of the founders of the enterprise. The children almost always being perfected can continue to prosper after the disappearance of the founder. In order to make large profits, the usurer and the merchant need high prices. That is why mortgages demand protective rights. The American trusts and the German cartels have contributed very much to causing the increase in tariffs. The usurer and the merchant often undertake to bring about scarcity so as artificially to create abundance. Thus is affirmed in a very clear way the opposition between industrial capitalism and the old capitalisms. Before capitalist production, it was commerce that dominated industry. The reverse is true in modern society, says Marx. And a little above, he writes, the law according to which the autonomous development of commercial capital is in inverse proportion to the development of capitalist production can be seen most clearly in peoples whose commerce consisted in carrying trade. The Venetians, Genoans, and Dutch realized a profit, not by exporting their own products, but above all, by assuring trade between nations or communities that were only slightly developed commercially and economically. Consequently, by exploiting the producing countries, the capital had an existence independent of and clearly separate from the branches of production to which it served as an intermediary. The monopoly of this role of intermediary and the trade to which it gave rise declined in proportion as the peoples on whose exploitation it lived developed economically. This fact is indicated not only by the falling off of several branches of commerce, but also by the decline of purely commercial states, proves incontestably that the development of capitalist production results in the subordination of commercial capital to industrial capital.
Here, Sorel quotes Marx arguing that industrial capital is destined to replace commercial and usurious capital, as their development is in an inverse direction to production. However, is this notion really true, or does it expose a Hegelian bias of Marx, which presupposes a teleological development of the capital stock? Hudsonites argue that in the modern period that not only have usurious and commercial capitalism has maintained their right to survival, but that also a rentier feudalism has overtaken industrial capitalism. We will see that in the following paragraphs, Sorel is in agreement with Michael Hudson, arguing that we should avoid establishing a rigid model of capitalism, as Marx has done.
Thus is established the Marxist view of the progression of capitalism starting from usury, developing through commerce, and culminating in large-scale modern production. We should now ask ourselves an important question about which orthodox interpreters of Marx do not seem to be too much concerned. Should the three stages be considered as successive, or at least designed to push former stages back into a region of historical impotence, or rather, should they be considered as capable of indefinitely preserving their right to existence, conditions of which being determined by national events? We know that a similar problem divides the interpreters of Hegel. Some say that, according to the Sage of Berlin, the first two forms of the free spirit, art and religion, must disappear when philosophy is entirely developed. Others maintain that art, religion, and philosophy can coexist. Marx accepted the first interpretation, for we read in Capital, "The religious world is only the reflection of the real world. The religious reflection of the real world can only disappear when the conditions of work and practical life present man with clear and rational relations with his fellow men and with nature." Thus, Marx obviously supposes that the philosophies of spirit and nature, as conceived by Hegel, could be called on to reveal themselves completely at the expense of religion. This interpretation of Hegelian thought led Marx in Critique of the Gotha program to forecast that at the end of the overthrow of the capitalist regime, there would rise first an order under which would reign the so-called collectivist principle, according to which each producer would receive a remuneration proportional to his work, and then a communist regime under which each citizen would be able to satisfy his needs. Those are personal opinions that could be discussed endlessly. It should be observed, however, that the Marxian concept of the free spirit has all the findings of history against it. All evidence tends to show that art and religion are not destined to disappear. Saviero Merlino was thus justified in maintaining that the collectivist and communist principles are not mutually exclusive, and that both are destined to be found in capitalist society, since all nations are undertaking social reforms. The same Hegelian biases inspired in Marx the idea of a technological development in modern production, resulting in the disappearance of small enterprises, which would be crushed by industrial giants. It is certain that, in many cases, industrial concentration represents a superior stage in technology. They have said earlier that the Marxists generally failed to examine the basis for this superiority. They reasoned in an abstract way in admitting the superiority of what impressed them by the enormity of its dimensions. The socialists seem to be in agreement today in recognizing that concentration does not make sense for agriculture as it does for metallurgy. But by the way in which they talk of small rural property, it is obvious that they understand very little about the reasons for its prosperity. They remain slaves to the biases that Marx had borrowed from Hegelian teachings, whose nature they do not understand. The biological idea found in the romantic notion of evolution makes any return to the earlier forms of society improbable. Marx thought that, when production had reached the stage where commerce is subordinated to industry, the forms he called antediluvian, and would never again appear in a country in the course of serious progress. In America, however, we have seen usury conquer under the name of trusts a large place in the economy. He never would have thought that the great factories could be replaced by the work of small family workshops. At the present time, however, we wonder if the use of small electric motors is not likely to produce, in certain regions at least, this transformation. It is advisable to make a less rigid model of capitalism than Marx has done.
Sorel traces Marx's view that industrial capitalism will exhaust usurious and commercial capitalism to Marx's interpretation of Hegel's development of the free spirit, one that was also erroneous. Sorel points to America, where the large trusts have conquered a place for usury in the economy, and also anticipates the expansion of small family workshops with the advent of electric motors. Therefore, Marx's opinion that industrial production would fully replace small property has been proven to be erroneous and false, just as his assumptions of the development of the free spirit. The next section of this chapter will deal with the role of manufacturing, the contradistinction between instinct and intelligence in production, Marx's view of free cooperation, as well as vocational education.
We are now going to examine how Marx understood the development of the organization of work in modern times. At the very beginning, merchants bought the raw materials and entrusted them to family workshops for a scale of charges, which gave rise to great dispute due to the bad faith of the entrepreneurs. Then they sold them, sometimes in the regional open markets, sometimes to powerful merchants established in the commercial centers. This regime, to which Laplace gave the name of the regime of collective manufacture, shows in a particularly crude manner the role of commerce in this old-fashioned industry. The merchant, who is usually called a manufacturer, although he manufactures nothing, is the man who does the thinking for a whole group of producers, whose horizon is limited to the execution of manual operations. An immense social revolution was accomplished when the entrepreneurs of collective manufacturers united the formerly scattered workshops into one factory. The old artisans did not let themselves be conquered easily. The small textile producers of Leeds, as late as 1794, sent a petition to Parliament demanding a law to forbid all merchants from becoming manufacturers. Thus, the new manufacturing concerns were established by preference in ports, export centers, or places in the interior situated outside of the control of the municipal regime and its trade guilds. Henceforth, there was a desperate battle in England between the old privileged towns, corporate towns, and these new seedbeds of industry. The producers who had acquired their right to work according to the old laws of apprenticeship found it intolerable that men without any technical qualification should compete with them.
Here, Sorel presents us with the class struggle between the old artisans organized into family and guild workshops with the merchants who built the centralized workshops. The corporate or guild towns tried to pass laws banning merchants from manufacturing to no avail. Thus arose what is called the regime of forced cooperation, which characterizes modern capitalism, which came out of the merchants speculating on collective manufacturing.
For a very long time, the chief question for the leaders of industry was to obtain an iron discipline, to which the working classes opposed the most stubborn resistance. Thus, it was not surprising that at the head of these establishments were often placed men without any technical knowledge, but endowed with those qualities of command one so often sees among officers who have come up from the ranks. Severe regulations were established to punish by heavy fines every violation of the regulations, however small. The application of the detail of this private legislation was entrusted to foremen who abused their power like real non-commissioned officers of disciplinary companies. For a century, all literature relating to industry has been full of the laments of humanitarians who are shocked by a system so little worthy of nations that, in their constitutions, seem most concerned with assuring liberty to all their citizens. This reigning system is what I call forced cooperation. It is opposed in a very clear way to the free cooperation of which Marx dreamed. Ignorance is the mother of industry, as well as of superstition, wrote Adam Ferguson, the teacher of Adam Smith. Thoughts and imagination are liable to be lost for a moment, but the habit of moving one's foot or one's hand depends on neither. Thus, we could say that perfection with regard to manufacturing consists in being able to do without the mind, so that, without any intellectual effort, the workshop can be considered a machine whose parts are men. The advance of the worker toward a completely mindless life seems to be the ideal of the leaders of this forced cooperation. The skill the worker acquires can, in the long run, be compared reasonably enough to the instinct of an insect. The stupefaction of the people was so well regarded as a normal rule in modern times that the first French translator of Adam Smith found unfortunate the latter's idea of combating by education the disadvantages presented by the division of labor. More than once I have explained the reason for the success of the division of labor in manufacturing. Since it was not yet possible to construct rapid and precise machinery, it was necessary to have men trained in a very advanced degree of automation, carrying out what mechanical devices could not yet do. Provided that tasks were reduced to a little movement of the hand or foot, one could succeed in obtaining a prompt and exact execution when habit had surpassed all thought. Men had also passed from the sphere of intelligence to that of instinct. One could say that this system of production illustrates in an amazing way the theories of Bergson on intelligence and instinct.
Here, Sorel outlines the system of forced cooperation, where instinct prevails over intelligence. Sorel points out that the foremen of industrial enterprises were more like a disciplinary company to instill in the workers obedience, rather than technical experts there to advise production. Thus, Adam Ferguson's notion that ignorance is the mother of industry proves true. That is, until a regime of free cooperation that was dreamed of by Marx and that Sorel will now outline.
In contrast to this system, let us reproduce the sketch of free cooperation Marx made on the page of Capital, where he speaks on the disappearance of religion. Social life, of which material production and the relationships that it implies forms the base, will not be disengaged from the mystical cloud that veils its appearance until a day when we will see the work of freely associated men acting consciously and masters of their own social movement. It is not by promulgating laws that we can attain such a state. It is not a matter of giving men the power of association according to their whim, but it is necessary to lead the producers to think without being slaves to errors of reasoning, prejudices, or instincts. We should not take Marx's text entirely literally. In this instance, as in many others, he wrote under the influence of Hegelian ideas. In order to be usefully applied, his words should be interpreted. One must understand that the socialist workshop would bring together producers whose minds would always be alert to criticize the techniques being learned, who would be guided by foremen similar to assistants of chemistry professors, and who would be supervised by engineers who would speak to their men as a teacher speaks to his pupils. In order to arrive at this economic state, production will have to have acquired the qualities that the progressive workshop develops under the capitalist regime. The scientific cooperation calls for workers who have received a good vocational education, gives them as direct bosses foremen capable of taking hold of the smallest idea for improvement thought of by the workers, conveying them to the less skillful men and thus accumulating the very small progress of experience, and puts at the head of the factory engineers whose ability is quickly recognized by everyone. Marx has defined in strong terms the opposition between this cooperation and that which industry has created. Large industry obliges society under the pain of death to replace the fragmented individual, burdened by a productive function of detail, by the integral individual, who will know how to handle the most diverse necessities of work, and in various functions gives a free scope to the diversity of his natural or acquired capacities. From instinct, then, we revert to intelligence.
Here the idea of Marx's free cooperation is reestablished. The socialist workshop will be administered by engineers and technicians, while foremen advise the workers as assistants to chemistry professors advise the pupils. The integral individual succeeds the fragmented individual, and there is a return from instinct to intelligence in production. Next, Sorel will talk of the importance of vocational education.
Marx complained that the bourgeoisie, which created polytechnical, agricultural, and other schools for its children, has given the proletariat only a mere shadow of vocational education. He hoped that by dint of the increasing influences of the working classes, the teaching of technology, in both theory and practice, would be introduced into the schools of the masses. And he added this important reflection. It is without doubt that such ferments of transformation, whose end is a suppression of the former division of labor, are in flagrant contradiction to the capitalist system of industry and the economic condition in which it places the worker. But the only true way by which a mode of production and its corresponding social organization advance towards their dissolution and metamorphosis is by the historical development of their innate conflicts. There is no better way of pointing out the importance of the role vocational education must play in the march towards socialism. In Materials for a Theory of the Proletariat, I have tried to give a sketch of what mass education could be in line with modern needs. The most difficult problem seems to be that of perfecting the men to whom supervision is entrusted. It would be necessary for foremen to have the qualities of observation found in the best laboratory workers. One could not succeed in the first attempt at forming a good overseer. Consequently, it has been asserted that schools do not produce good results for these non-coms of industry. It would be preferable that they be forced to work all their life. It is generally thought today that the preparation of engineers is greatly in need of improvement. I doubt that we are arriving at significant results in France because our experience with the history of the Polytechnical School is not encouraging. At the end of the 18th century, military engineers who, through the fortunes of revolution, had participated in the dictatorship of the convention, wanted to create an institution intended to teach the ideas in which they had been nourished during their years of apprenticeship. The men who represented their tradition were persecuted by the Pierre scholars, in whose eyes there is nothing superior to the art of playing with intricate mathematical functions. Today, Carnot's institution exists only in name. A known popularizer, despairing of our country ever rising to the technological level of Germany, asked that the defeated be forbidden to develop their scientific learning establishments to the same level as before. I am persuaded that if we have wanted to occupy the left bank of the Rhine for 15 years, it is much less in consideration of military guarantees than in the hope of stealing manufacturing secrets from the Germans.
Here Sorel explains that vocational education represents one of the most important aspects of the march towards socialism. The bourgeoisie has gone to great lengths to sabotage the prospects of vocational education for the proletariat by limiting technical education to the understanding of intricate mathematical formulas. In particular, the military engineers who were victorious in the revolution wanted to form an institution that would nourish workers with the teachings they learned from practical apprenticeship. But today, that institution of Carnot exists in name only. If we want to achieve a regime of free cooperation, it is imperative to improve vocational education, especially for the foremen, and it is likely that vocational education will take a higher place for itself over scholarly education.
At the time of the old systems of cooperation, work was conducted under the supervision of leaders who monopolized all thinking, to the degree in which the merchant character of industry disappears. However, this situation is only maintained by routine, and often the former role of the merchant masters of production is held by men who are only good at acting the part of important personages. Adapting Saint-Simon's famous parable to the present, I will say that all of the administrators of our railways, of Saint-Gobain, or of the coal mines could be dismissed without having the production cost of the merchandise go up 1 penny. These proud official representatives of economic France are as useless as the members of the French Academy, the sociologists, and the heroes of national defense. There is no scarcity of bourgeois representatives who maintain that the Russian Revolution proved that a country cannot do without intellectuals. They say that Lenin had to offer substantial salaries to the organizers of the enterprises he wanted to revive, and to engineers and foreign specialists of all kinds. But I have not heard it said that he felt the need of appealing to the intellectual powers of the deputies of the Duma, to the financiers who formerly established the connection between the Russian treasury and the financial community in Paris, or to the innumerable Joao who offer themselves so generously everywhere in order to restore the economy of Europe. Thus, I believe I was correct in maintaining in the socialist future of the syndicates that socialism would be a catastrophe for the intellectuals.
Here we see Sorel argue that the intellectuals and administrative officials can be largely dismissed without prices increasing. While the Soviet Union did need to offer substantial salaries to engineers and specialists, there was no appeal to the supposed intellectual powers of the Duma or to the financiers. This is why I have said that socialism would be a sort of lockout of bureaucratic management once the means of production are socialized. In an ideal world, all citizens would participate in production. With a large supply of labor and less overhead costs, it would be possible to reduce the working day while also improving productivity and wages. This would allow more free time for the intellectual endeavors, or for leisure, depending on preference. As someone who has undergone scholarly education in politics and international relations as well as economics, I can tell you that there are no great intellectuals in academia today. They are all thoroughly mediocre, and with regard to political education, their purpose is to simply indoctrinate the next generation of the useless intelligentsia with the ideology of modern liberalism. True intellectualism is autodidactic in nature, not academic. As Curtis Yarvin has said, the purpose of academia or the cathedral is to create cadre, not free-thinking intellectuals who can find a purpose in production. This is why I have chosen to complete my master's degree in journalism, rather than becoming an academic. Journalism is a lofty profession which shows no signs of disappearing through either revolutions in the productive forces like AI, or revolutions in social organization. Journalists in this way can be likened to cockroaches. I have found a loophole in the catastrophe for the intellectuals. We will now move on to the third section of this chapter, which deals with stages of capitalism traced by Kautsky, trusts and cartels according to Paul de Rosier, the American's penchant for isolation, the illusions of the trusts, and the relation of trusts to socialism.
In 1912, Kautsky presented ideas on the development of capitalism which are in complete contradiction to those of his master. Marx had taught that England was the classic country for the modern economy, and consequently the one in which it was possible to find facts useful for developing theories. Going much further, he had dared to write that the most industrially developed country only serves to show to those who follow it on the industrial path the image of their own future. As a result, industrial capitalism was destined to prevail everywhere, just as Marx observed it happening in England shortly after the middle of the 19th century. On the other hand, Kautsky maintains that England has ceased to be the classic land of capitalism, that Germany and America are developing with much more vigor, and that it is in these two latter countries that we must study the future of England. The experience of the trust shows that high finance is each day becoming more the master of industry. It supports militarism, the politics of violence at home and abroad, and the struggle against the working classes. Thus, we would be mistaken to expect a progressive reduction of social conflicts similar to that which took place in England in the time of Gladstone. Immediately, we notice something paradoxical in Kautsky's doctrine. He conceives the future of the country in which industry has made the boldest development in terms of the remnants of Prussian feudalism. The great landed interests today are enthusiastically in favor of strong power, if possible, monarchical. As court nobility, they think they can exercise personal influence on the monarch, and through him the government. They are crazy about militarism, for it opens to their children the career of officer, to which the sons of bourgeois seem less suited. Thus, they constantly recommend a violent policy at home and abroad. Likewise, high finance is very predisposed to favor militarism, a strong government, and a policy of war. It has nothing to fear from the strong power independent from the parliament and the people. It controls this power by personal influence exerted at the court, and besides, the power is its debtor. Men of money do not see militarism with an indifferent eye. Public debts are viewed by them not only as creditors, but also as providers of this fate. It is extremely difficult to believe that America, or even England, resembles the picture drawn by Kautsky. I will limit myself to explaining here what he says about the new forms of the capitalist economy. According to this expert on social democracy, the German cartels and the American trust belong to the same economic type. This is not the opinion of Paul de Rosier, who is an excellent observer. In his view, the cartels were born out of reasons of a commercial nature, to avoid the lowering of prices by the overproduction of a factory directed too boldly. To better the utilization of common interests among several producers would inevitably result in the formation of a highly disciplined association, assuring the defense of these interests in return for exact obedience. Many times in his book, Paul de Rosier returns to the fundamental psychological principle of the cartels. This conservative character of the Germans, disposed to compromises concerned with security rather than triumph. The moderation of the German character would not suffice to assure the survival of these leagues of producers in the spirit of discipline, of a meticulous and exact discipline, did not reign among the members. Here again we find the effect of the social habits of the nation. Paul de Rosier contrasts the cartel and the trust in an unusually clear way. The former, he says, is a league of allies in which each one preserves a certain liberty of action, but forbids himself the usage of certain weapons against the others. It represents a temperament more or less brought out in the economic struggle. On the other hand, the trust is the result of a struggle to the death. One is the German solution, the other the American solution of a problem posed in Germany as in America by the industrial system. These two solutions are as different from each other as the economic, social, and political conditions of the German Empire are different from the economic, political, and social conditions of the American Republic. They are not of the same nature. On the one side, there is a defense of common interests. On the other, domination. A despotic domination over the members of the trust and enterprising against the non-members. The German remains moderate. He does not dream of a resounding triumph. The American is ambitious of power, much more still than money, which he loves as a conqueror loves his troops and his cannons, because it assures him power. The trust is an instrument of domination for him. The difference between the cartels and the trust is not a difference of degree, as is often said, it is a difference in kind. I believe the trust is related to usury capitalism, and the cartels to commercial capitalism.
By contrasting the observations of Paul de Rosier with Kautsky, Sorel arrives at the conclusion that the trust is related to usurious capitalism, while the cartel is related to commercial capitalism. The former is a struggle to the death premised on the domination of those within the trust and the extermination of those outside. The latter is a league of allies which echoes the conservative character of the Germans, who are disposed to moderation. Thus, lumping in the trust with the cartels is erroneous because they both arise out of different forms of capitalism.
In order to understand fully the procedure followed by the Americans in the conduct of their affairs, we must remind ourselves often that these men are of the independent sort. The American of Anglo-Saxon origin, says Paul de Rosier, is self-sufficient, and if he likes the company of others, this liking is limited to his home, that is, to his wife and children. Neither his sisters, brothers, nor cousins are for him anything else but neighbors. He does not have the clannish spirit that characterizes certain peoples of Europe. He does not feel any particular attachment to his relatives, and even more, he habituates his children to fend for themselves at a very early age, to prepare themselves to try their luck. So well that many Frenchmen established in the United States reproach the Yankee fathers for their selfishness. The rural life predominant for such a long time in America favored the spirit of isolation. Formerly, the nation, almost entirely agricultural, was comprised almost totally of independent landowners. Few tenant farmers, few large fortunes, many farmers. Such was New England then. We have seen, in certain states of the West, very similar conditions. Independence was the normal condition. The old character still exists in the new states because they are settled under the leadership of the Yankees. The large landowner of the West, 9 times out of 10, comes from the eastern states. He is a Yankee who has made himself a farmer, perhaps only temporarily. It is he who upholds the American tradition and imposes it on the incoming group. What sustains the Americans in these enterprises so full of hardship is the innate love of independence. In order to succeed in becoming their own masters, in living in their own house, they accept everything: solitude, absence of the most elementary comfort, and the dangers of a wandering life in an uninhabited region. I think when one could say the American population preserves to an extraordinary extent the peasant qualities of being combative and dominating, which give it a certain similarity to the old equestrian orders. An old Civil War colonel expressed the same opinion when he declared to Paul de Rosier, "We are an imperious race."
Here we understand that American culture is defined by the love of independence, owing to its Puritan and peasant spirit. The American spirit is characterized by going to great lengths to ensure this independence, which separates it from the clannish spirit of the peoples of Europe. In the footnotes, Sorel remarks that this love of independence and national exclusiveness is what has driven them to accept the illusions of protectionism.
The instinct of association is very old in Germany and is directly opposed to the quasi-feudal sentiments of the Yankee. Historically, the instinct of association seems to be connected to customs of serfdom. The extreme discipline always exercised by the German state has only served to develop ideas of individual weakness, submission, and moderation ambition, which Paul de Rosier points out as characteristic of the cartels. The history of Andrew Carnegie is particularly suited to show the contrasting feudal character of the trusts. American industrialists who wanted to make agreements with him sometimes perceived that they had promoted his schemes without participating in his profits. With such a man, born for domination, there is no possible equitable association. I believe that the preceding explanations are sufficient to show that trusts and cartels have as their foundation historic national conditions. Thus, they cannot be thought of in abstract terms as economic systems capable of universal application. The large American bankers have an obvious interest in making their customers believe that trusts represent the best type of industry. In this way, they can widely practice what economists in their country call watering. They take advantage of the illusions of small capitalists in issuing many more shares of stock than necessary. They create two types of stock. Preferred stock generally receives an advantage of 7% before other stock is paid. And if there is a year when the profits do not allow giving them this remuneration, the holders of these stocks exercise their rights on the profits of the following years. The common stock receives something when the masters of the trust believe it is useful to interest the public in speculating on this paper. The preferred stock serves to pay the industrialists whose companies are bought. The common stock is supposed to represent the savings due to consolidation. Thus, the speculators must urge their publicists to entice the public by these problematic savings.
Thus is established the unique national conditions which give rise to the trusts and the cartels. The cartel is related to the Germans' long history of association, which comes from serfdom, while the trusts are established according to the Americans' character of independence, to whom association arises out of the swindling of the small capitalists in the public, issuing them two different types of stock. Thus, the character of usury is established for the trusts, while the character of commerce is established for the Germans.
This literature succeeds rather well because the American is very easily dazzled by the colossal. When Paul de Rosier visited the United States for the first time, people spoke to him with admiration about mammoth farms where wheat was cultivated by the methods of large industry. After many peregrinations, he ended up by discovering a farm of 22,000 hectares and one of 16,000. They came from concessions made to railroad companies, and the owners cultivated only a part of them for the purposes of advertising in hopes of attracting settlers. On the largest farm, only 6,000 hectares had been worked by means of modest horse-drawn plows, and the surface was divided into 5 centers of cultivation. The Americans have been impressed by the success of the Standard Oil Company and of the Sugar Trust. They believe too easily that every attempt at large monopoly must produce great benefits. Paul de Rosier has told how the whiskey and rope trust lasted only a short time. The success of the Sugar Trust depends almost entirely on tariffs that prevent foreign competition, and on the fact the bosses had to pay off the politicians very dearly. Havemayer, who is the mainspring of this monopoly, affirmed before an inquiry commission that the origin of all the trusts was tariff protection. That is surely not the case for the Standard Oil Company, but this company knew how to make arrangements with the railroad companies so that the latter would transport the petroleum of its competitors at a very high price or with great delays, and would not permit pipelines crossing the tracks, which these competitors might be tempted to build. If we agree with the historical philosophy of Marx, we must say that in spite of all the talk of Kautsky and the admirers of Pierre Morgan, the trusts do not characterize an era of superior capitalism unless it can be demonstrated that these organizations, so deplorably usurious, give rise to incontestable progress in the instruments of production. Now here is the opinion of Walker, president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The trusts destroy competition and the invention power of the people. I consider them absolutely pernicious. They constitute a veritable tyranny, and America will rid herself of them as she knows how to rid herself of all tyrannies. By what means this will take place, I do not know, but I have confidence in the enormous force of public opinion in this country. Against such an authoritative opinion, the admirers of trusts would have to bring solid proofs, but they have not done so. In order to utilize all the byproducts of the refining of petroleum, large establishments are necessary, but it is a long way from such a concentration to the monopoly of the Standard Oil Company. We do not see what technical progress an ocean trust could introduce into naval art.
The trusts for Sorel are deplorably usurious, and do not mark a stage of superior capitalism that can be transformed into socialism. The trusts often impede the development of industry by impeding competition and inventive power. We can see this today with the development of AI, where the large tech firms of the United States, such as OpenAI, a private firm where Microsoft is entitled to 49% of its profits due to their large investment, has been outflanked by a small subsidized private firm in China, which created the more efficient DeepSeek. In People's China, where socialism is predominant, we see technology evolve at a rapid pace. Much of it is due to the lack of usurious and rentier capitalism and the weaker state of intellectual property. DeepSeek is also partially the product of a hardware bottleneck due to trade restrictions on more advanced AI chips going into China. This, I think, demonstrates the superior proletarian dynamism that exists in socialist countries, as opposed to the usurious and rentier economies of the West. Software rent is distinct from profits made from production, as it directly impedes the development of better technology, so much so that an AI model designed under duress to work on inferior hardware has made greater breakthroughs in AI than the large tech firms, so much so that DeepSeek wipes billions off the stock market and poses an enormous threat to Nvidia, the leader in AI hardware.
Numerous American socialists have greeted the success of the trusts with enthusiasm, because it seemed to them that the trusts constituted a forward step to the nationalization of large industries. The matter seems simple enough to people used to resolving historical problems with abstract formulas. But when facts and men are considered such as they are in reality, the socialist beneficence of the trusts no longer seems as evident as it does to Kautsky. According to Marx's hypothesis, the bourgeoisie will deliver to the revolution an industry in which the factories will be subject to a truly scientific direction. One can say that in current scientific work, individuals are just about interchangeable. Thus, it will be easy for the socialist regime to maintain good management over production, thanks to the cooperation of groups whose members will have received a serious scientific education. A management under which the good methods learned in the schools will be continuously applied, and in which esprit de corps will eliminate the inefficient workers. Thus, the transition will be brought about by an economic bridge, whose solidarity we must be careful not to undermine during the years of preparation for socialism. According to Kautsky's hypothesis, this economic bridge does not exist, since until its dying day, industrial capitalism would not be able to give a predominant place to science in its factories. After a system in which the wills of the imperious masters are made so apparent, only a state socialism could succeed, in which politicians would rule in place of financiers. The men whom the latter had chosen as auxiliaries would certainly not be replaced by bureaucrats to advantage. For a kind of small feudal baron would be substituted people possessing finesse, flexible docility, and contempt of honor, which qualities were formerly displayed by aristocrats protected by the kings.
Here, Sorel rejects the idea that trusts are a forward step to the socialization of the means of production. The nationalization of trusts and the replacement of financiers with bureaucrats would be akin to replacing the small feudal barons with men who possess the qualities of aristocrats protected by kings. Thus, it would not be to an advantage. What must take place is an economic bridge to socialism, where the administration of production is placed under a scientific management. Thus, in the dying stages of industrial capitalism, and then to the advent of socialism, the administration of production will be carried on by engineers and technical specialists, not financiers and bureaucrats. In the footnotes, we have a very interesting quote by Sorel on the familiarization of the population with notions of a bureaucratic state socialism after the First World War.
In the course of the First World War, the bourgeois governments let themselves blindly create a quantity of institutions that have familiarized populations with the idea of state socialism. It is against state socialism, much more than against capitalism, that true Marxists should battle. This fight is all the more necessary because it cannot be seen how the transition could be made from state socialism to proletarian socialism.
Sorel agrees that we already live in socialism. However, it is necessary to say that it is a bourgeois bureaucratic state socialism that we live under, not a proletarian form of socialism. Thus, the system of production which dominates us today and is a socialization of financial, usurious capitalism placed under the tutelage of bureaucrats is what true Marxists should battle against, as opposed to capitalism, especially industrial capitalism, which is a much more progressive system in which the economic bridge to proletarian socialism can be achieved. Now we will move on to the fourth and final section of the chapter. This section deals with the conditions under which Marx's predictions are relevant, the inefficacy of social democracy, disintegration according to Proudhon, and the rebirth of socialism under the influence of Bolshevik ideas.
The preceding considerations tend to show us that the march toward socialism will not come about in a manner as simple, as necessary, and consequently, as easy to describe in advance as Marx had supposed. Marx's Hegelian leanings led him to admit, without being generally aware of it, that history advances, at least with regard to peoples considered to be blessed with a superior civilization, under the influence of the force of the mysterious Weltgeist. This ideal agent imposes on matter the obligation of realizing ends whose logical order is finally discovered by men of genius. Like all romantics, Marx supposed that the Weltgeist operated in the heads of his friends. There's a certain amount of truth in this doctrine. Fortunate happenings, which have often been called providential, lend themselves rather well to a division into periods that can be defined, each one by a characteristic that can enter into a logical order. Such an arrangement gives substance to a group of past events that philosophers find too interesting to admit could completely escape the intelligence. But we must be careful not to mistake such scholastic schemes for laws operative in the future. The pretension displayed by Marx in speaking scientifically of the march toward socialism is very defensible, if, like him, we admit that we are on the eve of a catastrophe that will put an end to the bourgeois regime, whose continuation would cause great social harm. After 1847, capitalism seemed to be so exhausted to Marx that it had become incapable of producing new stages in its economic development. Thus, all that could happen until the hour of the revolution must belong to the last of the stages recognized in the study of the past. The utopians, who believed that an ardent sermon by properly cultivating the will of good citizens could lead the world to the realization of fantasies dear to their hearts, seemed to Marx to be ignoramuses, incapable of perceiving the forces acting around them. The social mechanisms, whose laws were given by the movements of his time, seemed to Marx to incontestably comprise a true work of science. 35 years after the publication of the Communist Manifesto, Marx did not perceive any essential change in the social economy of Europe. Long before the American trusts were spoken of, the great financiers had gained millions by merging 9 companies or railroads. Thus, it was demonstrated that usury capitalism had not spoken its last word. A number of businesses that could have been excellent vegetated as a consequence of the enormous sums levied on them by their organizers. It does not seem that Marx discerned the important reasons that were to give Lassalle's idea supremacy over his in Germany. He did not understand much about the consequences that followed the end of the War of 1870, which extended to all countries of Germanic culture the principles of Frederick the Great. These illusions would be difficult to explain if it were not admitted that Marx easily abandoned the terrain of the materialist philosophy of history in order to let himself be guided by the doctrine of the Weltgeist. Social mechanisms were no longer empirical data, but agents of the mysterious force of history. There was no longer a need to examine history, since a scholarly study of the past had led to the discovery of the modern method of action of Weltgeist, without a determination of the duration of this method of action.
Georges Sorel critiques Karl Marx's historical materialism, arguing that Marx's Hegelian influences led him to overestimate the inevitability and simplicity of socialism's triumph. Marx, according to Sorel, viewed history as driven by a quasi-mystical Weltgeist, world spirit, which logically unfolds towards a predetermined socialist future. Sorel contends that Marx's predictions, such as the imminent collapse of capitalism after 1847, proved inaccurate, as capitalism demonstrated resilience through financial innovations, corporate mergers, railroads, and adapted to new conditions. Sorel also highlights Marx's failure to foresee key developments such as the rise of Lassalle's reformist socialism in Germany or the socio-political impact of the Franco-Prussian War. Ultimately, Sorel accuses Marx of abandoning empirical analysis in favor of a romanticized, deterministic view of history, which led to dogmatic and unrealistic expectations about socialism's advance. Thus, we arrive at a justification of the notions of a mythic struggle against capitalism that escapes narrow determinism presented in Sorel's Reflections on Violence. Here, the advent of socialism was arrived at through the myth of a general strike, which is a voluntary participation on behalf of the proletariat. The advent of the socialism was no longer the process of historical laws following from industrial capitalism, since usurious capitalism had not spoken its last word. Socialism then must become a moral philosophy, centered around working-class struggle against the capitalists and the myth of the general strike. The advance towards socialism then is transformed from the realm of deterministic historical laws to a philosophy of praxis.
The war of 1914 upset every conceivable idea of the future of social democracy. The German army was probably defeated less by the strategy of the generals of the Entente than by the anti-nationalist propaganda that Lord Northcliffe had succeeded in having spread in Germany by independent social democrats. The emperor abandoned the fight without wishing to engage in civil strife, believing that social democracy would be better managed by Western democracies than the monarchy of the Hohenzollerns could be. The social democrats believed that they were not buying too dearly the right of making the happiness of the German people by accepting great territorial losses, endless humiliations, and the disappearance of military institutions before which our politicians had so long trembled. From the standpoint of the working class, the record of the socialist government is not brilliant. It massacred masses of workers as Candlemass had done in 1848 and Thiers in 1871. It signed a treaty that condemned the German proletariat to work, perhaps for a century, in order to enrich the bourgeoisie of France and England. This government does not dare to enter into friendly relations with the Soviet Union because the Entente does not permit it to draw near to Russia. According to the Entente, Russia has the audacity to defy democratic principles. Kautsky, accustomed to making sovereign decisions in international congresses, thought he would be the supreme arbiter of peace, but he fell to the level of a third-rate folliculaire. He had to content himself executing suspicious tasks to suit the enemies of his country and of the proletariat. No one declaims with as much violence against the Bolsheviks, whom our diplomats are so afraid of seeing appear one day on the Rhine.
Georges Sorel sharply criticizes German social democracy for its role in World War I and its aftermath, arguing that the German army's defeat in 1918 resulted more from anti-nationalist propaganda and socialist dissent than military failure. He condemns the Social Democratic Party, SPD, for betraying the working class by suppressing revolutionary uprisings, accepting the punitive Treaty of Versailles, which he saw as enslaving German workers to enrich French and British capitalists, and refusing to ally with Soviet Russia under pressure from the Entente. Sorel also mocks Karl Kautsky, once a leading Marxist theorist, for becoming a marginal figure who served Allied interests while vehemently opposing the Bolsheviks. Writing from a syndicalist perspective, Sorel dismisses reformist socialism as a failure, contrasting it with the Bolsheviks' revolutionary defiance of Western capitalism, His critique reflects broader disillusionment with mainstream socialism after its wartime compromises and post-war concessions to bourgeois democracy. These facts illustrate the contempt the working class must feel towards the Social Democrats, who do nothing but serve the interests of international finance, militarism, and bourgeois democracy.
So many new things have been introduced into the world that great value can no longer be attached to the categories that, according to Marx, were to remain unchangeable until the revolution. Henceforth, everything is given into disorder. Nothing is necessary any longer. No predictions are possible. I think it is useful to bring to the attention of my readers an important passage from a letter written by Tru-Dank on October 29, 1860, to a doctor of his region. Under Louis Philippe, social dissolution had already begun, and philosophical minds could not doubt that an immense revolution had commenced. Today, civilization is very truly in a crisis of which we can find only one analogy in history, that which determined the rise of Christianity. All traditions are worn out, all beliefs abolished. On the other hand, the new program is not made. I mean that it has not entered into the conscience of the masses. This is what I call dissolution. It is the most atrocious period in the existence of societies. All factors unite to distrust good men. Prostitution of conscience, triumph of mediocrity, confusion of truth and falsehood, compromising of principles, baseness of the passions, despicability in customs, suppression of truth, rewards for lying, base flattery, charlatanism, and vice. I have few illusions, and I do not expect tomorrow to see in our country a resurgence, as if by a wave of the wand of liberty, respect for law, public honesty, frankness of opinion, good faith in the newspapers, morality in government, reason in the bourgeois, and common sense in the plebeian. No, decadence, and that for a period of which I cannot see the end, and which will not be less than 1 or 2 generations. That is our lot. I will see only evil. I will die in complete darkness, marked by my life's record with the seal of reprobation in a rotten society. The situation is even more serious than in 1860, because we're coming out of a war, what is the source of innumerable ills. Supposing that Napoleon III could once again launch France into adventures, Proudhon said to Chaudet on October 27, 1860, "My profound conviction is that we are entering more and more into the era of dissolution and trouble. Mass slaughter will come, and the prostration that will follow these bloodbaths will be dreadful. We will not see the work of the new age. We will fight in the dark. We must embrace ourselves to endure this life in doing our duty without too much sadness. Let us help each other. Let us call out to one another in the darkness. And each time that the opportunity presents itself, let us do justice. That is a consolation of persecuted virtue. Let us not then be astonished to find a frightening prostration everywhere at the present time. This phenomenon is in the nature of things." We can say of our time what Proudhon said to Michelet on January 23, 1860. "We will not be extricated from this state of affairs except by a sweeping revolution in ideas and in men's hearts. You and I are working toward the revolution. That will be our honor in the eyes of posterity if she remembers us. Social democracy is being cruelly punished today for having fought with so much tenacity the anarchists who intended to make a revolution arise in men's minds and hearts."
We today are not so estranged from the dissolution of Proudhon's and of Sorel's time. We are emerging out of a series of bloodbaths in the Donbass, in Gaza, and very likely soon in Kashmir. Bloodbaths whom are legitimized by the follies of the mainstream press, who incite a confusion of truth and falsehood, who prostitute their conscience and swindle public opinion. Likewise, public morality is in decline. Reason is absent in the bourgeois just as common sense is becoming absent in the plebeian. Intellectuals seek to confuse man and woman at the expense of goodness and truth. These are signs of the dissolution of our post-World War II civilization, and there seems to be no close end in sight to decadence.
It must be observed that today there exists an overwhelming historical fact that can reaffirm the courage of the revolutionaries. Everywhere the workers feel a sense of solidarity with the Republic of the Soviets, while the bourgeoisie feels an affinity for the anti-Bolsheviks. The Pope, After having taken so many precautions in order not to be accused during the war of deviating from the neutrality which to him seemed required by his position as father of all Catholics, intervened on the day that Poland was seriously threatened by the Red Army. In his eyes, it was not a question of disagreement between two republics about entirely temporal interests. The Bolsheviks seemed to him to be the destroyers of all the civilization to which the Church had adapted, just as the Albigenses had been viewed by Orthodox sages of the Middle Ages. For want of daring to preach a crusade against the new heretics, the leaders of the hierarchy engaged the faithful to pray that heaven intervene in favor of Poland. A number of great men of the bourgeoisie, like the heroic burgomaster of Brussels and cartloads of other heroes, have expressed their horror at the conduct of the workers who refused to give their labor for the sending of arms or ammunition to Warsaw. Moreover, the proletariat, even in England, where the Third International of Lenin is not very popular, felt a sense of solidarity with the Soviet Republic. They did not listen to the competent people who purported to show them that, in the Russo-Polish conflict, right was on the side of Poland. For them, just as for the Pope, it was not a matter of international politics, but of the social question posed in all Europe by the development of economic conflicts. Many workers until that time wondered how correct writers were who represented the absolute proposition of socialism as false literature. But for almost 3 years, the Bolsheviks had resisted Europe under far more difficult conditions than those in which our convention found itself. Thus, we must admit that under normal conditions, socialism could be applied without too much difficulty.
In this passage, Georges Sorel highlights the growing ideological divide between the working class and the bourgeoisie in the wake of the Russian Revolution, emphasizing the workers' instinctive solidarity with Soviet Russia despite bourgeois opposition. He notes how even the Pope, who had remained neutral during World War I, openly sided with Poland against the Bolsheviks during the 1920 Russo-Polish War, framing the conflict as a civilizational struggle akin to the medieval church's crusade against heretics. Sorel contrasts the bourgeoisie's horror at workers refusing to aid Poland with the proletariat's unwavering support for the Soviet Republic. Even in countries like England, where Bolshevism was not widely accepted, for the workers, the conflict was not merely a territorial dispute but a broader class struggle, reinforcing their belief in socialism's viability, especially given the Bolsheviks' ability to withstand immense external pressure. Sorel concludes that the Soviet experiment proves socialism can be implemented successfully under normal conditions, countering critics who dismissed it as unrealistic.
In a letter of May 21, 1858, Proudhon said to his doctor, Gratien, that his book, De la Justice, while being too difficult to become popular, would still have considerable influence. The profundity of science henceforth guarantees its certitude, and it is certitude that assures the rapidity of the advance. Now, how many readers are needed in order to have this certitude pass from theory in itself into the public consciousness? A few dozen, no more. The rest will catch what they can, and what they learn from science will guarantee them the rest. The importance for the future of socialism of this certitude, so effectively shown by Proudhon, is possessed today by the people in a far more solid way than could be done by the more or less direct effects of a book. It results from the example offered to us by the Soviet Republic, the sentiment of the sublime, which never dies in the public popular soul, moved by the account of the prodigious voluntary sacrifices of the Bolsheviks, sanctifies the certitude of socialism already admitted by intelligence. The example of the Soviet Republic has the effect of giving an unusual confidence to the partisans of socialist intransigence who have so much difficulty in fighting against the reformists. The latter take their stand on the not very sublime sentiments that are found most often in their souls, and they are supported in varying degrees by the political leaders of the bourgeoisie. The advice that Proudhon gave to Chaudet on June 24, 1860, concerning the publication of the Courrier du Dimanche, is still useful to contemplate today. Beware of the small opposition. Do not argue with despotism. Do not let it be believed that you take its legality seriously, and that you are thinking of overcoming it by means of the imperial law. You would humble yourself, and one fine day, unbeknownst to you, you would find yourself caught in the trap and humiliated. In France's present state, if one starts in earnest to attack the empire with equal weapons, it could go on for 100 years. By that time, as the storyteller says, everyone would be dead and the country in full decline. What is necessary is an energetic war, a clandestine press, open disapproval, conspiracy, if need be, and finally, when there is no way to do anything else, silence. Yes, silence. What silence would not weigh 100 times more on this subject than the harangues of the Oliviers and Jules Favre's? I believe it worthwhile to reproduce here the last lines of the Insegnamenti Sociali della Economia Contemporanea. Early Christianity could very probably have obtained toleration, like so many other exotic cults, as did Judaism, but it sought to isolate itself. Thus it provoked distrust and even persecutions. It was the intransigent teachers of doctrine who prevented the new religion from taking a normal place in Roman society. There was no lack of wise men who treated Tertullian and all those who refused to accept any conciliation as madmen. Today we see that it was thanks to these supposed madmen that Christianity was able to form its ideas and become the master of the world when its hour had come.
In this passage, Georges Sorel draws on Proudhon's writings and historical parallels to argue for the necessity of revolutionary intransigence in advancing socialism. He cites Proudhon's belief that even a small vanguard of committed intellectuals could transmit socialist certitude to the masses, a process now accelerated. Sorel argues, by the living example of Soviet Russia, which has inspired workers through its revolutionary sacrifices, contrasting this with reformist compromises, which he views as capitulations to bourgeois legality. Sorel champions Proudhon's militant advice, rejecting incremental opposition in favor of clandestine resistance, open defiance, or even strategic silence when necessary. He concludes by likening socialist revolutionaries to early Christian martyrs like Tertullian, whose refusal to compromise with Roman society ultimately ensured Christianity's triumph. For Sorel, the Bolsheviks' unyielding stance, like that of the early Christians, proves that only through absolute intransigence can socialism achieve its world historical victory. Now we have reached the end of the chapter. I hope you all enjoyed this study of Sorel's The Illusions of Progress. Next time we will be studying Proudhon's presentation of the historical and religious figure of Jesus Christ.
Congratulations, you have reached the end of the video. The genius of Pierre Tru-Dank's work is the result of both strenuous study and the schizophrenia caused by the consumption of marijuana. If you haven't already, I urge you to subscribe to this channel, as well as to check out the links in the description.
Something to remember, just a kiss.